Hello, everyone. This is the 77th episode of the Soccernostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles, and I'm joined by Paul from Shipland, England. For this episode, we interview Mr. Tony McLaughlin as we discuss John William Madden, the Scottish pioneer of Czech football. Mr. McLaughlin is a Scottish national who has lived in the Czech Republic for many years. I have to admit, I was largely unfamiliar with the story of John William Madden. But in the last year or so, I came across many references about him and his role in the early years of Czech football. And one of these was your article for the Celtic Star a couple of years ago. So welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, guys. Thanks for inviting me.
If you could just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your early football memories and history with the game.
As Shahan said, my name's Tony McLaughlin, and I'm originally from Glasgow in Scotland, and I'm a lifelong Celtic supporter. I've lived in the Czech Republic for about 7 years now, but I have been back and forth from here since I was a student, which I'm kind of showing my age, which was over 20 years ago now. I did a year's exchange in Prague as a student. So I suppose my earliest football memories, I had a few, but I think my first Celtic game was in 1984, I believe, when I was just about to turn 6 years old. And it was Celtic against Dundee United at Celtic Park, which Celtic won 1-0, but I don't really remember that much about the game. It was more the whole experience and the atmosphere, the people, the colours, all that stuff that got to me, and I've been hooked ever since, I suppose. My late dad, John, was a big Celtic supporter too, and he was even in Lisbon when Celtic won the European Cup against Inter Milan in 1967. So I suppose it was passed down a lot of his stories. So it's like a generational thing. Being a Celtic supporter, certainly two of my kids are Celtic supporters too. I think in football overall, I've always played football at grassroots, at various levels and grassroots levels. Even now, I'm getting on a bit. I'll be 44 this month, but I still turn out for a local team here in the Czech Republic for their B team at my age, obviously, but FK Radosevice. So, and I've done some football coaching as well. I suppose getting on to the John Madden story, I think, as I said previously, I studied at the Charles University in 2001, 2002 as an exchange student from the University of Glasgow. And I was aware of the story of Madden and the basic terms. I don't know, maybe as a young guy in my early 20s, I had more pressing things on my mind than like studying some dead football guy and looking into that. But the more, I suppose, over the years, I've learned about Madden's life, the more I've been intrigued. I just think it's a great story, even if it's not just about football. You know, it's obviously there's a football journey, but it's an immigrant tale on two levels. Both him from being Irish immigrant stock, like myself. His parents were Irish immigrants to Glasgow. There's a love story involved. There's even a bit of tragedy in it with the early death of his son. So I think in some ways the human story is just as interesting as the football one. So I suppose that's, just to sum up, guys, that's how I ended up here. I wrote this blog post that Shahan came across a while ago. So I must thank you guys as well, because I've been looking to do something with this information that I've gathered over the last 2 years. So in some ways, being invited here has made me get my finger out and organise some of my thoughts, some of the information that I'd gathered over that period, which was the best part of 2 years ago when I released. I wouldn't say I used to. I'm still an occasional blogger, not just about sports and football, but in various things, art, culture, politics, society, that I have a go now and again. My background, I work in communications for various companies over the years. So sometimes I find it quite therapeutic just to write stuff for myself, if you know what I mean. So that's where this came about, and here I am. So again, thanks for inviting me, guys, and making me organise my thoughts and my notes on this.
So in discussing John William Madden, let's start with his early life. So what is known about his early years?
There's actually quite a lot known. not all of it might be accurate. I must say that I owe a big debt in terms of the research to a gentleman called Ian Stewart, who's an ex-history teacher and a historian, and indeed the former secretary of his local Celtic supporters club in Edinburgh. And just in case Ian watches this at some point, I just want to say thank you to him and to get well soon. He's not been keeping very well of lately, the last couple of times I've been in contact with him, so I hope he's doing better. But Ian had carried out quite a lot of research on Madden's initial family roots in Scotland and Ireland before that. So John Madden was born, and I'm consulting my notes now. There's actually something that's not, everyone refers in the Slavia banner, is commonly referred to as John William Madden, but I think that some census records just refer to John Madden without the William, so I don't actually know if it's his official name or something that was added later. But anyway, he was born on the 11th of June in 1865 in a small house in High Street in the town of Dumbarton, which we'll talk a bit more about later. He's actually listed in some places to have been born a day later, but the records at that time aren't as accurate as they are now, so I believe it's on the 11th. John was, as a boy in his family, he was called Jake rather than John, and later on, intermittently, he was referred to as John Madden, Jake Madden, or Johnny Madden in the media during his career. So it seemed as if they used these names interchangeably almost. So actually, my own dad was called John, but his father was John too, and he was always called Johnny as well. So it was kind of interesting for me in that personal way. But anyway, he had been John Madden's parents, Edward and Agnes, were Irish Catholic immigrants to Scotland. They were married in Port Glenone in County Antrim in 1845 and had emigrated to Scotland shortly afterwards, initially to Glasgow before making their way to the town of Dumbarton. The parish records at the time aren't 100% accurate, of course, but there's other evidence that point to Agnes, whose maiden name was McInvenna, and other evidence that she came indeed from the town Port Glenone where they were married. And John's father, Thomas, came from somewhere around the town of Magherafelt, which is in County Derry, which isn't far away from Port Glenone. It's about 16 kilometres, I think, in new money. So Agnes's parents and younger brothers joined Edward and Agnes later, actually. So it was quite a bleak historical time for Irish people. If you look back, it was around the time of the Great Hunger in Ireland. So it was quite a difficult place to be. So it was a period of mass immigration of Irish people to other parts of the world. Anyway, eventually after settling in Dumbarton, Agnes and Edward had a total of 9 children. But tragically, only 5 of those 9 children, they survived until adulthood. There was quite a big gap, if you look, between the oldest sister, Matilda, who was born in 1847, between John Madden, who was the 8th child born to the couple. So there was 18 years between the brother and sister. Just a little bit about Dumbarton. I don't know if you guys are... It's a very interesting and quite a dramatic setting, I suppose, for them to go. Dumbarton's about 20 kilometres from Glasgow on the north bank of the Clyde, and it sits on the River Leven itself, which flows into the Clyde. It's dominated by a volcanic rock. It's called Dumbarton Rock, which dominates the front of the town and oversees it. Indeed, Madden's first football club, and indeed people from the town are always commonly referred to as Sons of the Rock. And it would have been a very bustling industrial town at that time. The town, firstly, it took a lot of its wealth from glassmaking, but later on it became a real industrial town and a hub of shipbuilding and distilling. Probably something that unwittingly the place is known well for amongst internationally. It's the home of Ballantine's Whisky Distillery, which is quite a popular whisky brand throughout the world, which is the distillery is based in the town. Just going on to education, which was quite interesting in terms of there's no records to my knowledge of the Madden children having much in the way of a formal education. This was despite there being a school connected to the local Catholic Church, which actually had received a positive educational report in 1877 when John was 12. So he might have received some kind of formal education, but we don't have records of this. He might have just been at the age where he just missed it, but we don't know. But anyway, and economic necessity would have dictated that he had to find work quite soon. So as a teenager, he went to work in the famous Denny's shipbuilders of Dumbarton. Denny's was famous probably for the construction of a world-famous ship, the Cutty Sark, which also had ultimately a whiskey named after it, which maybe made it more famous over the years. That would have been constructed when John was a boy before he started there, but Denny's was really seen as being a hub of innovation. It was the first yard in the world, apparently, to build ships with steel hulls. And with that in mind, I suppose, John Madden quickly made it to the position of riveter. Sometimes he's put forth as a boilermaker, but I'm sure they were connected, the two posts. But that's quite important because a riveter was seen in the shipyards as something that was a slightly better paid position and something that required skill and the ability to work under pressure. So I think looking at that his early life to the later life, there's some evidence that Madden was a guy who was something of a go-getter, if you want to say something. He was a guy that knew how to pursue opportunities. So I think that would lead to his early life, but I think his early life was quite typical for an Irish immigrant family coming to his father had found work in the quarries and then as a labourer in the shipyard, so it would have been a common story with our lads, but there was a lot of tragedy that they grew up with as well for the young family growing up. But I think there's definitely early signs that Madden would have been a guy that would have been going forward to achieve something from his early life.
What was his entry into the world of football in Scotland? It seems he was a bit of a trailblazer there as well.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly was. I mean, I think you guys will probably know better than me. I think some of your previous podcasts have focused on guys like Lord Kinnaird and Scotland and England, certainly led the world in the development of football in that era. Madden initially played football with two clubs in Dumbarton before the Dumbarton FC, Dumbarton Albion and Dumbarton Hibernian, which would have been an Irish club at the time, Hibernian being the Roman name, or Hibernia being the Roman name for Ireland. There was a lot of Hibernian clubs in Scotland at the time. The most famous one that was based in Edinburgh, which we'll go on to speak about in a minute. But yeah, he made his first enter into senior football. That was in the 1886-87 season with Dumbarton. And he became the club's first Catholic player. And I'm not saying that there would have been anything about Dumbarton and the club itself. I'm not saying that at all. But it still must have been quite intimidating for an Irish Catholic guy to enter into a changing room populated by Scottish Protestants. It was a time when sectarianism and anti-Irish sentiment was rife, and around Scotland, particularly in the west of Scotland, or the central belt of Scotland. But there was, if there was any dressing room issues with that, they quickly evaporated by Madden scored in his debut and became a star player of the team. He actually reached the Scottish Cup final that year where Dumbarton lost to Hibernian. And looking at some of the history of Celtic, that victory was actually a really important moment, I suppose, in accelerating the birth of Celtic later that year in 87-88. So there was a huge crowd actually that showed up at not the Hampden Park now, but the previous Hampden Park, which is quite a short way away from where Hampden Park's situated now. But there was a huge crowd turned up of 15,000 at the time, which a lot of the Irish, or Glasgow-based Irish immigrants were supporting the Irish formed club from Edinburgh, Hibernian. There was moves already made to set Celtic up, but certainly that victory at Hibs showed the potential, for Irish support for football in the west of Scotland, I suppose, at that time. It's important to note that Scottish football at that time was governed, officially at least, by a policy of amateurism until 1893, whereas in England, professionalism had been permitted from 1885. So it was easy to see what pushed Madden to play the next two seasons in England. He played firstly for Gainsborough Trinity, which is in Lincolnshire, I believe, and then Grimsby Town in further north in England. This can't have been easy for Madden. On a Friday night, he would finish his shift at the shipyard and then catch an express train from Glasgow down to England, and he would arrive wherever his game was. He would then collect his amateur, in inverted commas, money before getting the train back to Scotland, and he'd probably arrive on Sunday or even Monday. He'd have to arrive back to start his shift on the Monday morning. It puts some of the maybe pampered nature of recent footballers or contemporary footballers in place. It must have been quite tough and tiring, when you combine his physical work in the shipyards with the travelling and the football. It must have been quite difficult for him, But anyway, perhaps that regime got too much over time, and he came back at Dumbarton for the 1888-89 season. Interestingly, he'd played in the Dumbarton team, which lost 4-1 to Celtic in the semi-final of the Scottish Cup that year. There's an excellently researched book on Celtic's early years by Brendan Sweeney, and he actually identifies that Madden was very much targeted for a lot of foul play. He identifies a contemporary report at the time, which reads, "The only regrettable incident was the rough treatment accorded Johnny Madden. 4 free kicks in succession were given against the Celts for rough work against the Dumbarton Irishmen, and surprise was felt on all sides that the Celts should single out one of their own kith and kin. It was rumoured that Madden had disappointed the Celts by refusing to don the green and white jersey after having promised to do so, and this being the case, it seems the players were paying off an old debt." Despite this apparent animosity in the air, Madden in the next season, he and indeed 2 of his Dumbarton teammates joined Celtic. And again, maybe that shows something about his strength of character. If he had been maybe talking about joining Celtic, but never, he had stayed loyal, I suppose, to Dumbarton. Maybe there was other reasons for that. But then even being targeted by, a number of players, and then he would join them in the dressing room that season. So that was his pre-Celtic, I suppose, career, although he had guested for Celtic in their first ever game.
Let's talk about this significant debut as a guest for Celtic Glasgow.
I think it was very significant, not just for Madden, but all the players that were selected as guests that time. Historical analysis points to that first Celtic team as being something of, if you like to use modern parlance, it would be like an all-stars team of players in Scotland from Irish stock. As well as Madden, there was 2 players from Renton, one of the top clubs in Scotland at the time, James Kelly and Neil McCallum, and Mick Dunbar of Hibs, who we've already mentioned, and the Mealy brothers, Willie and Tom. That's noteworthy as well, because Willie Mealy at Celtic had a longer tenure at manager or a far longer tenure than Madden had in Prague at Slavia. He was the Celtic manager from 1897 until 1940. But at that time, his brother and he were both third Lanark players. But all of these guys would go on, who played in the first game. They would go on to be Celtic players, even though they were clubs of other things. I think if you look at this kind of cynically, I suppose, Celtic's founding fathers certainly had one eye on the future, both in terms of putting a competitive team in the pitch. And I think that they firmly had their other eye on professionalism, which was around the corner, or I think it was already underway on the quiet, but they certainly had that. But I think going back to Madden, his guest appearance in that first game showed that he was a player of some standing in Scotland, to the extent that his name, as well as these other guys who were selected for the first Celtic team, they could be used almost to attract a crowd, to draw a crowd. So I think that shows something about his standing in the game and why it was significant that he was one of these guest players in the first instant.
Can you describe his subsequent career at Celtic?
I think to give you the short answer, it was greatly successful. He made over 150 appearances and scored 70 goals, which I think in any year is a good strike rate for a player. He won 3 league championships medals at Celtic and played in the club's first ever league game, which was in 1890, was the first year of the Scottish League. He played at least one game in the 1892 Scottish Cup final. This was a game that was replayed despite Celtic winning the first game 1-0. The reason given this was consistent encroachment on the field by spectators. It's murky. I don't think that Madden had the opportunity to play in the replay. I don't know if that was due to injury, but there's a few sources that list him and a few that don't as being on that side. But anyway, Celtic won 5-1 and became cup winners that year for the first time. So he was part of the squad, which was Celtic's first Scottish Cup, which now I think Celtic have won 40 times. So that was the first one. And he was also on the losing side in the two subsequent years. First, the Queen's Park, who were formed in 1867 and were at that time very much the establishment club in Scotland. And then the next year in 1894, they lost to the first final they played against Rangers, who would become Celtic's great rivals. But the rivalry at that time was very cordial. It wasn't what we would know now as the Celtic Rangers rivalry, which is one of the, most talked about in the world, I would say. Madden played he was an attacking player, as his goal record would suggest. He typically played centre forward, but sometimes on the right wing at outside right. He had the nickname of the Rooter on account of his powerful right foot shot, which apparently the Rooter name was also to do with some elements of his private life, but I won't go into that at this point. But he was called the Rooter in this case because he had the power to uproot. His shot had the power to uproot goal nets. Apparently, he was something of a fan's favourite as well. So there was an anecdote I picked up that there was some experimental lighting like in the stadium that was erected around Christmas in 1893, and the Celtic fans at the time nicknamed this Madden Shipyard. I suppose a lot of the fans, maybe his work in the shipyards where a lot of the fans would have been involved in, kind of heavy industrial work, might have endeared them as well to the fans more because he understood the value of a hard day's work, I suppose. His Celtic career was one that was characterised by success, mainly.
There is a story that he was signed by Sheffield Wednesday in 1892, but after a practice match, he was convinced to return to Celtic by a Roman Catholic priest. Is this true?
I don't know. That's a short. It's a very nice story, but I don't know. There might be elements of truth in it, like some of the other stories about Madden's life. I'll go on. There's a mention of this in there's a book by a guy called Paul Looney, who was it goes back to the 80s. I remember that being, and my dad had it. It was like a complete record of 1888, 1890. It goes all the way to the 80s to 1982. And he refers directly to this. He says that Madden became the subject of a kidnapping by Sheffield Wednesday, but their attempt to secure his services was thwarted by a local priest who spirited them back to Glasgow and to Celtic after he'd only spent 2 days in the Yorkshire city. And for me, I think this is a very nice story, but I think it's quite easy to be sceptical about it. I think it's more compelling to look at the timing, maybe. We already talked about professionalism in Scotland and the difference in timing when it came into effect. Professionalism came into Scotland the following year after this instance in 1893, but had been informally practiced for a while. I don't think that Madden was going to Sheffield for the experience or the challenge, as sometimes modern football is referred to. I think I'm pretty sure he would have been going there for financial gain or even to use the whole episode as a bargaining tool. I mean, it's possible that Celtic used the priest to act as a go-between, but it's hard to believe that Madden wouldn't have been made some kind of offer or a better offer to stay at Celtic, whether this was immediate or it was deferred until the official introduction of professionalism, which would come into play the next year. I mean, interestingly, actually, I'm just back. I was recently in Glasgow. I actually grew up right beside Hampden Park in the Mount Florida district of Glasgow, and I visited Scottish Football Museum at Hampden Park. It seems that at that time, of supposed amateurism or shamateurism, as people were calling it, was Celtic and other teams found like creative ways to reward players, while still adhering to amateur principles, in the way of gifts and things like that. So at Hampden, one of the artefacts that I came across was actually presented to Madden by Celtic. So it's this. He was awarded a silver tea set, which was very impressive and expensive looking, and it's basically for winning a five-a-side tournament in 1890. So he'd won it. It actually says it's like Celtic FC AA Sports. I don't know what the AA stands for in this, but maybe one of them was like amateur. And it said 9th August 1890, five-a-side football competition, first prize won by J. Madden. So I think these gifts would have been sweeteners to, encourage Madden, to stay over the years. But I don't think it was enough to have his head not turned by Sheffield Wednesday's overtures a few years later. But yeah, I think it's a nice story about the priest. And I mean, I don't know, there might be some element of truth in it, but I would go with the financial gain angle for me. But call me an old cynic, but that's my view on it.
Can you go through the remaining years of his playing career?
Yeah, of course. I think his last act, according to a Glasgow Herald article, was a benefit match which was held in his honour. Again, the opposition for this friendly was Rangers, who actually won the game 5-1. But there was a crowd of 10,000 at Celtic Park then, and it was this was on the 7th of September in 1897. After Celtic, his career appears to peter out. I actually looked at some of the SFA records. It was really interesting when I was at the Hampden Museum, and it was very interestingly, the guys there, the curators, the lads at the museum, were saying that these record books are actually they're handwritten record books that were somehow they're laced with cyanide. So as one poor guy found out to his cost. So they have to use gloves when they're handling it. I don't know if it's from the binding process of the books itself or the ink. But anyway, these books show that Madden had signed for Dundee in September 1897, and then before being transferred a couple of months later in December to Tottenham Hotspur in London. He only played 4 games for Dundee and then 6 for Spurs following that, and he seemed to retire from playing in 1898. So that was the end of his playing career. Was when the last team he played for was Tottenham, but it's not that clear if it was in competitive action or he was playing. But he'd certainly been registered as a player for both Dundee and then Spurs. Interestingly, maybe it was an oversight on my part, but I never saw him at any point. Just to go back to the previous story, I haven't been officially registered with the SFA anyway with Sheffield Wednesday. So I don't know if he'd signed anything, just to go back to that other story, which maybe would, if that is the case, it would have added to the idea that his soiree in Sheffield was something that he was using as a bargaining tool. But overall, to answer the question, his career seemed to ebb out a little bit after he left Celtic.
He also represented Scotland at international level. What can you say about his national team career?
It was very short and sweet. He made 2 appearances for Scotland in the Home International Championship, the British Home International Championship at the time. Both these games were against Wales in 1893 and 1895. He actually scored 4 goals in the first game and another goal in the second. So it's a very prolific international record to score 5 goals over the space of 2 games. It's unclear why he didn't gain more caps, or even play in the next match after scoring 4 goals in his debut. You think after 4 goals you would be the first name in the team sheet. Again, with the cynical hat on again, to put it on my head, perhaps with Madden's Irish Catholic background, he wasn't quite Scottish enough for some of the selectors at the time. I don't know, that's mere speculation in my part, but it does seem very strange why he wouldn't be capped more, especially given his form in his debut. I think he was very unlucky not to play again or play in the next match.
At the end of his playing career, how did his transition to management come about?
I've been trying to fill in the blanks with my research in this period. There's something, this period where he finished playing in 1898 until he arrived in Prague in 1905. There's something of a gap. I've actually been in touch with the Scottish Maritime Museum, which is actually based, coincidentally, in Dumbarton. And so I've opened up some dialogue, trying to do some detective work there, but it would be useful to find out if Madden actually continued to work in the shipyards, be it in Dumbarton or be it elsewhere. One other report actually says that he'd moved away from Dumbarton to Partick, which is now an area, the city of Glasgow, also near the river, an industrial area, and he was working as a labourer then. So after he finished he hangs up his boots. There's a bit of a mystery. The only thing that I can find that how the transition to management, he seems to have been working in some kind of backroom role for Celtic when they tour, which I'll talk about a bit later, when they have a tour which they play a game in Prague against Slavia in 1904, which would have been a year before he arrived as the coach. So, but I don't really have that confirmed. I'm still looking to find out a bit more about that, about his involvement in the Celtic tour at the time. There was 2 Celtic tours that definitely happened, but they happened later. I think the first one was in just before the First World War in 2014. But I think the short answer to that, unfortunately, guys, that at this stage I don't really have much information about that period. There seems to be a bit of a hole in the story. Hopefully some further research will shed new light on it.
So how did he end up at Slavia Prague in 1905?
I think that's a good question. There's a few different theories. I think if not necessarily connected to football, but I think when historians look at migration and movements of people, I think they always look at push and pull factors that might influence people's movements and why they made the choice, or it was through necessity to move to a different place. I think Madden's story, certainly in that regard, isn't different. I think there's always with this length of time that's surpassed, there's always going to be they're always going to have to do some kind of informed speculation. But I've come across some interesting theories. There was a Scottish football historian called Ian Campbell Whittle who comes up with 2 interesting theories about why he ended up in Prague. He points to a relationship with a teammate at Tottenham called George Payne, who worked in an agricultural business, who had some business in this part of the world and around Prague. And this theory states that Payne recommended Madden to Slavia. The problem with this is that there's a player named Payne at Tottenham at the same time as Madden, but his name is Ernest, not George. So this would be, it could be a simple admin error, but again, it could be something. It makes this theory a little foggy, It could be something else. The recommendation theory, I think, is one that's quite strong, but that someone helped Slavia to get the right man in place by putting Madden's name forward. I think that seems very plausible. But there's another romantic theory which is corrected, I suppose. But whether this is true or not, it's a great yarn. It's a great story. This was that Slavia actually wanted as their next coach a guy called John or Jock Robertson, who was a very decorated player, and he played for Everton, Chelsea, Southampton, and Rangers in Glasgow. And he'd also been captain of the Scottish national team. And Slavia were looking at him to be the first real trainer of Slavia. The thing was that Robertson was actually from the Dumbarton area. He was from a place called Milton, which is just outside Dumbarton. And apparently with the help of another Dumbarton-born ex-Rangers player and Scottish international, a guy called Finlay Speedy, they spread word of Slavia's need for a coach. And this was passed ultimately to Madden, who then travelled to Prague and had dressed himself in some Rangers colours, like a Rangers hat, and presented himself under a false pretense at Slavia. Like I said, I mean, to me, that seems a little fanciful, to put it mildly, but I think, on some level, this idea that he was proposed by someone else, I think, seems quite plausible. Interestingly, actually, the Slavia, maybe for their point, they didn't recruit Robertson. It was maybe a good thing for Slavia. After the former Scotland captain he played a very big role, and he was the player manager of Chelsea, and he had a really integral role in their development in London. But later in his career, as a manager, he actually joined Madden in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was the coach of MTK Budapest in Hungary from 1911 to 1913. And his spell there actually didn't appear to be overly successful. One local newspaper apparently said of him a few years after he returned to the United Kingdom, Robertson had a good eye for players, but drunk too much strong alcohol. So maybe the Slavia dodged a bullet in a way, but who knows if they were actually seeking Robertson in the first way. I think there's issues with all of these theories, and there's a few more that float about. I'm actually meeting some of the Slavia historians over the next couple of weeks, so maybe they could shed some light about the recruitment process. But for me, it seems obvious that in line with a lot of continental European clubs at the time, Slavia were looking to recruit a coach from Britain, from the British Isles. And I think that there's a lot of evidence that Madden had a good standing in the game in Scotland, but also from his time in England. And there's also several things over what we've already talked about that point to his kind of strength of character and single-mindedness. So it appears that someone really could have recommended Madden to Slavia. And I live in hope that, more evidence will appear, that primary something that Madden said or something like that, because there's still a bit of a mystery about how Slavia recruited him. But I suppose when we talked about the pull factors, but I think there was also several push factors that led him to try his luck somewhere else. Madden was 30 years old at the end of his 33 years old at the end of his playing days, and like I said, it's unclear whether he kept working in the shipyards. But assuming that he did, he maybe saw a life of hard work and in the Clydeside wind and rain, and it made him think of a different life abroad. I think other family members who, after the blog post, a couple of his American families members got ancestors who are based in America got in touch, and it was fantastic that he did, and they gave us some illuminating thoughts about his family and what they did. A lot of them settled in the Eastern Seaboard, but that's maybe another story. But certainly there was a lot of reasons why people in industrial Clydeside at that time would think to move abroad for a better life. I think another reason maybe that pushed him out of Scotland, I suppose, was that Madden had never, well, according to my early research, he was unmarried. But maybe there's some accounts that he was divorced, but I haven't seen any concrete evidence of that. But it would have been quite unusual for that generation that a 33-year-old man would have been unattached. So it might have been more complicated for Madden to up sticks and move abroad if he had a wife and children to support at the time. He might have had to stay in the shipyards. But going back to the historian who got in touch, Ian Stewart, his research didn't find any record of the death of Madden's mother, but she would have been about 80 at the time when Madden was moving to Prague, which would have been a very old age for that, considering the life she had. So if we can assume that she'd passed away by then, that's another reason that would mean that he was maybe a bit more free than some of his contemporaries to move away if he didn't have a duty of care to his mother. But I suppose I've been looking into this quite a lot about his early days, and it's very interesting to me. I've always been intrigued by the story. And I've been looking at a Czech language account of Madden's life. And this was, it's kind of semi-official from Slavia. It's from an organisation, Odpor Pratel Slavia, which kind of means Friends of Slavia, translates. But they point to Madden having been, what I mentioned earlier, in Celtic toured the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1904. So, like I said, I have to get this confirmed from the Celtic side. I'm going to do a bit more further research, but apparently Celtic beat Slavia 4-1 during this tour in 1904, which was in May. So it was probably at the end of the Scottish football season. And I think if Madden was indeed part of that travelling party, he would have, who knows, maybe it would have planted a seed in his head about opportunities that he might have had abroad. Or even if he made contact with Slavia directly. I mean, it was only 1 year between this apparent tour and his appointment. And he was appointed in the early part of the year, so something might have happened there. So, yeah, so I think that's a long answer to a simple question, I suppose. But I suppose we don't really know everything about, and I don't think we'll ever know. We can try to say, but there was certainly some strong reasons that were pushing him out of the industrial Clyde side, but were also pulling him towards Prague.
What is known of his early impressions of Czech footballers in these early years of the 20th century?
Yeah, I mean, the shorter answer was that his early impressions weren't favourable at all. He obviously saw the level of the Czech players as being somewhat below what he'd encountered in the UK, I suppose. He certainly wasn't impressed by the level of commitment to what he'd found. So I think what's quite interesting about Madden, actually, about his life just generally, that even in all the time that he lived there from 1905 up until 1948, he'd never learned to speak Czech fluently or even passably. He apparently spoke in a kind of strange hybrid of English, Czech and German, just bearing in mind that there was still a lot of German speakers at that time in the city of Prague, and obviously been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But there's a quote attributed to him in this kind of hybrid language, which I translated with the help of a Czech friend. And basically it says, Czech players are no good. They think they know everything. They train a little, then chase girls and go to the pub. They're only interested in having fun and have no energy to play. So I think, given that quote from his early days, I think it's a fairly safe assumption to make that he wasn't deeply impressed by his initial impressions of Czech footballers.
What were his innovations on and off the field that many believe revolutionized Czech football?
I think it's connected to the previous question, I suppose, that he brought a more professional, serious attitude to football. I think that in Slavia, and I assume in Czech football generally, they saw football more as a pastime rather than the serious business that Madden saw it as. I think in terms of the innovation, I don't think the Scottish dimension can't be underestimated in this. I think this might be a controversial statement, but I think around about Madden's times, the Scots were arguably more advanced and influential than their English neighbours, in the development of tactics and football generally.
Scotch professors.
Of course, yeah. So the Scotch professors maybe preceded Madden slightly, but they'd brought a passing style English football. But I think in the early years of English football, many teams were dominated by Scotch players. It was partly maybe due to the professionalism issue that we spoke about as well. But they were also, we touched upon Jock Robertson, his fellow Dumbartonian, who he had a big influence on the development of Chelsea. But there's also like the first Liverpool team in 1892 was consisted entirely of Scottish players. And the Sunderland side, which were very successful, relied on a majority of Scottish players, as did a lot of English clubs at the time. So I think it was very much a breeding ground for ideas about football and tactical innovation. And given that Madden certainly seems to have had a sharp mind and headstrong personality, I think he must have taken some of this on. There's clear evidence that he brought this kind of what was then cutting edge knowledge about tactics and implemented them at Slavia to great success on the pitch. I think maybe looking at other Scottish coaches further forward into the future, I'm thinking of Ferguson or Jock Stein or someone like that. These guys like Shankly, Busby, these type of classic Scottish managers. He was also a disciplinarian. One of the first things that he stopped his Slavia players smoking and drinking before and after games, which he also introduced new kind of exercising and training methods. You're looking at, it was almost like Madden was looking at a very kind of elementary or type of sports science, which we think of now, or sports psychology. He seemed to have been big on diet and preparation and recovery and these types of things. He was even known to make his own herbal potions to help players be the best, in the best possible position and recover from injury quickly. He even apparently ran a sports injury or conditioning clinic, which, with the help of his wife, who we'll go on to talk about in the next section, who they rented a room in the stadium and treated players on every Thursday. So it's quite it was quite interesting. He was certainly an innovator, and maybe he could have been looked upon as, I don't know if there was similar coaches doing similar things in the UK, but certainly in Czech terms, these were very new innovations to football and very professional, I suppose, with what had gone before.
Can you talk about his personal life in Czechoslovakia, where he met his wife and had a family?
Yeah, of course. I don't want to sound pedantic, but it's maybe quite important to the story about this. Czechoslovakia wasn't formed until after the First World War through the Treaty of Versailles. So it was still Austro-Hungarian, the Bohemia within the Austro-Hungarian Empire at that time. Czechoslovakia wasn't a thing. But what's quite interesting about Madden's life, I mean, we touched on some of you mentioned yourself, Shahan, about the Scottish professors, but also some of the other guys that were seen as missionaries, around the world for football that came from Scotland. But Madden didn't seem to have any other reason to be there, unlike the other ones. So I'm thinking of guys like Alexander Wilson Hutton in Argentina, who was a school teacher, Archie McLean in Brazil, who was in textiles. Also in textiles was John Lawson, who had a big role in bringing football to Sweden. And as John Harley in Uruguay was a railway engineer. And there's several other examples of guys like this who came from Scotland. But they had professional reasons to be where they were, if you know what I mean. But Madden only focused on football. He'd been recruited to Prague just to be a football coach and enact change within football. In regard to his wife and his personal life and family, he certainly didn't waste any time when he was in Prague. He arrived in Prague in 1905, as we've discussed, and pretty much instantly, it seems, he developed a relationship with the daughter of his landlady, who's Františka Čechová. And they obviously had a romance. She was an employee of a laundry who took care of Slavia's jerseys and things as well. So maybe that was another. But he soon married her. It's noteworthy that she was 17 years his junior. And then again, in terms of starting their family, they didn't hang about either, because their son, Jindřich Richard, who was known universally as Harry, Jindřich being a Czech version of Henry. And so he didn't mess about in that regard. But in saying that, certainly with Františka and John Madden, their love story was a very enduring one. They remained together until he died in 1948. And their relationship survived a real tragedy when Harry, the son, who was actually a promising player, he'd also taken after his father. He was a striker who'd played in Slavia's reserve, but he sadly died. He took his own life. He threw himself in front of a train, which the Slavia website attributes to a broken heart of some unrequited love that he had. So it was an awfully tragic story that he'd faced in his life. I don't know, maybe it's one of those things that's a nice story, but it could have been, unfortunately, so many young men are beset these days by depression, and there's a bit more knowledge about it. So maybe it was something like that, rather than a broken heart. But yeah, it was a pretty sad story, I suppose. But yeah, but he certainly seemed to fall in love pretty quickly when he arrived in Prague. And like I said, what was quite interesting about it, compared to some of his contemporaries or near contemporaries, was that he was there purely for the football. So it seemed as if it was just football and family were the main parts of his life, there.
At the onset of World War I, as a British citizen, he would have been classified as an enemy from a foreign nation. How was this period of his life? Did he remain or leave? How much is known?
I mean, my research so far hasn't unearthed a massive amount. As far as I understand it, he appears to have stayed during the war. I think we have to remember, although he was I suppose he was a citizen of what would have been an enemy country. By that time he'd already lived in Prague for about the outbreak of war. He'd been there for at least 9 years, and he had a young wife and young son. I think what's important to remember as well in terms of in this regard, that Madden seemed to have a very good life, and he appeared to have been very happy in Prague. He seemed to have made a good income from doing a job that he loved, and he had a beautiful young wife, and the couple were regarded as snappy dressers in their day. They were. I suppose Madden seemed to be one of these guys that got more handsome as he was older. He kind of grew into himself. He was quite a dashing, kind of mustachioed figure. So he was. I think the point is, I'm trying to make in a long roundabout way, was that he had a lot keeping him in Prague if we're going to that kind of push idea rather than returning to Scotland. So apparently he met Jock Robertson when Jock Robertson was in charge at MTK Budapest, and he remarked that training in Prague is better than tightening rivets in the shipyard. So there's probably a bit of truth involved in that, that he didn't really say. So he wanted to stay in Prague. He obviously loved life in the city, and although he was maybe an enemy national, he was married to someone who wasn't. So that situation can't have been unique. It must have been happened to other people as well. But it's actually quite interesting. There's an article that I found online which relates to Madden from a Celtic legend, really, Jim Craig, who was one of the Lisbon Lions team that I mentioned earlier, who won the European Cup for Celtic in the 60s. And he actually says he's talking about the Second World War. So that would have been when he'd already been long retired. But he rather stayed even under the German occupation in 1945. And one of the reasons for that was that he was afraid that he would lose his pension. So I think even from we mentioned earlier, from a kind of young age, he didn't have much attachment to his home place, be it Dumbarton or Glasgow or whatever. He didn't seem to have a lot keeping him there. So maybe in a similar way, he didn't really have a lot to go back to. But I'm hoping that some of the chats that I'll have with there's maybe in my research, it's a bit lopsided in terms of there's more stuff from the Scottish side than there is from the Czech. So I'm hoping in the coming weeks and months that maybe some more facts or almost facts will become clear in the near future. We live in hope.
Madden remained at Slavia until 1930, a period of 25 years. So it's equivalent to Alex Ferguson or Arsene Wenger type of connection. Can you describe his success with the club?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it was that unusual in that era that they would be very long serving. I mentioned, for example, Willie Maley at Celtic had a much longer tenure than Madden did, and I think the other clubs you see this as well. But bearing that in mind, I mean, 25 years is still a long time in anyone's life. So it was very much, I mean, he transformed the club and led it to what would have been a golden era of success, I suppose. I've got some of the stats in front of me here, so I'll just kind of shamelessly read them out. But under Madden, Slavia won 134 domestic matches out of 169 against international club sides who would have been touring and been around the place. He had a good record as well. He had 304 wins out of 429 games. This was between his 25 years at the club. He also won the main local cup competition 4 times between 1908 and 1912, and the formation of the Czech League apparently, as the Czechoslovak League was in 1925. I think there was like a Bohemian League before that, which was slightly different. But obviously, Czechoslovakia had all the Slovak teams and Moravian teams as well, so it was a lot more difficult to win, presumably, with more teams. But he won the first Czechoslovak title in 1925, and then he won it again in 1929 and 1930. I think a real highlight actually for Madden would have been actually when Celtic toured again in 1922. Celtic had toured in Austro-Hungary before the war, but this was the first time they'd visited the new Czechoslovakia. Apparently this was from Celtic history books as well. This was a really brutal match, but ultimately Slavia won 3-2. And I think Madden must have been proud of this victory, because in some ways he did see himself as very much a Celtic man, and he was very proud of the club, and he saw them as something of a benchmark for others to follow in football. So I think he would be very pleased by that. So he actually quit though immediately after winning his last league title in 1930, and Slavia had defeated Sparta in a derby match, meaning that Slavia had won the league and they'd finished the season undefeated. But apparently he stood up at the clubs at the after-match winning party, and he took to the floor and simply said, "I'm done. I've got nothing more to give you." So, I mean, they were always like 65 at the time. So, yeah, maybe, I mean, he'd had a very eventful life. I'm sure he was quite tired. But yeah, I mean, getting back to the question, he obviously had a transformational effect on Slavia and led them to a golden era. I mean, I think there's a lot around Slavia, there's a lot of reverence to him and among Slavia supporters and historians, that they basically say that Slavia wouldn't be the same club if it wasn't for Madden's influence.
There's even a stand named after him. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I would go on to talk about that a little later. Yeah, but there's actually a stand named after him, and near the main entrance to the stadium as well, to the main stand, there's another that I suppose the John Madden stand, but it must be about 8 foot high. Or 2 meters high, sorry, outside the stadium, that gives basically a profile of Madden and his influence in the club. I mean, there's other people there as well, but he's obviously held in great esteem here, especially amongst Slavia fans, obviously.
Describe his life in Czechoslovakia afterwards, for the rest of his life.
I mean, we have touched on that, I suppose. He was still around. I mean, he quit in 95. I think it was 83 when he died, so he was still around for a fair while. But he remained in Prague. I mean, he obviously loved Prague, and he loved his life there. As far as I'm aware, he remained involved in roles in football. He was doing some coaching and with younger teams and offering advice and being involved in Slavia on various committees. But it was noteworthy that he didn't interfere with the current first team coaches and things like that. I don't think that was really in his personality. He was very much in the background, but he certainly was in the background. He continued to. He was a very regular attendee at games at Slavia Stadium. So I think he always stayed involved. As to his life, I mean, I think we mentioned before, like, he enjoyed his life there. They were very much quite a glamorous couple, I suppose, and at that time. And talking about golden ages, I suppose the first Czechoslovak Republic, before obviously the tragedy of the Second World War and that occupation and things like that. It's often referred here in what is now the Czech Republic, but the first Czechoslovak Republic is seen as quite a kind of almost like a golden age, a glamorous time. Something that was like halcyon days, I suppose, of this country. But I think there's something about the story. I talked about how this is a kind of interesting human story, but there's even like it's almost like his death, dying in 1948 when he did. It's almost got historical roundness to it. So that was the year when the communists came to power and Czechoslovakia became a communist state. So it's kind of like, I don't know, it almost seems like appropriate that he would die in that year because he had come to the end of an era, I suppose.
And he never returned to Scotland at any point, right?
I mean, I don't know if he travelled back for some other reason. I mean, maybe in further research we'll find that out. He'd certainly left behind some family in Scotland, like in terms of his extended family, but like I said, I don't know if he had. I think we're assuming that his mother had passed on and his dad had passed away a number of years earlier, so he didn't have a massive amount of things pulling him back. I don't know. It was 25 years. He might have travelled back for a visit or maybe for football reasons or something at that point. But he was certainly not. He didn't live in Scotland. He stayed in Prague until he died.
If there is a comparison, could he be considered as the Czech equivalent of Jimmy Hogan, who's credited as a pioneer of Hungarian football in a similar era?
I think that I've got limited knowledge of Hogan, but I think there's some parallels between their both life and certainly the influence and how they're viewed now in these two countries. But also they've got some other things in common. They were both the sons of Irish immigrants. Off the top of my head, I think Hogan was born in Burnley or Blackburn or somewhere around about there. But he was the son of Irish immigrants who were working in heavy industry. And both of them had clear ideas about how they wanted the game to be played. Interesting, actually, with Hogan, there's a Celtic connection there too. Hogan was actually a coach at Celtic in the 50s. I remembered his name because my father's hero growing up in the 50s was a player called Charlie Tully, an Irish player who played as a winger for Celtic and was very much a fan's favourite. And Hogan had been brought in at Celtic in the 1950s by the chairman because it was a really kind of lean time in Celtic's history. So he was brought in. His approach was that Hogan was brought in to kind of shake things up and bring some of these like innovative training methods. But I mean, while there's similarities and parallels you can draw, I think the stories are quite different too. Madden was very loyal to Slavia and remained in what seems like his beloved Prague until his death. Whereas, it's quite a long time, but Hogan only spent 9 years comparatively in Hungary, and that was over two separate spells. He had also coached during his career in Holland, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and England, and indeed in Scotland, as I previously mentioned. But there are some parallels, but I think the stories are quite different, But maybe there is that parallel in terms of how they're revered in Hungary, in Hogan's case, in Madden's place, and here in the Czech Republic. One interesting historical coincidence actually is that Hogan actually, his first spell at MTK Budapest, actually took over the aforementioned Jock Robertson from Dumbarton. He was actually the coach before Hogan took over for his first spell. So it's quite interesting that someone from the same town in Scotland. And obviously there was that connection, or this yarn about Jock Robertson and the Rangers connection and Madden's recruitment to Slavia, and then this journalist saying that Robertson drank a little bit too much. Maybe that's why they brought Hogan in the first place. But I think there are obvious parallels what we've spoken about, but while they've got some things in common, I think that their stories are quite different. And he was quite a bit younger Hogan was quite a bit younger than Madden as well. But I'm sure the paths must have crossed, over their times here. But I don't know. I would like to think that they were both respectful of each other and stuff like that. But I suppose that would require kind of further research.
I want to repeat that I was not familiar with Madden's story, and I've learned that he's regarded with reverence in the Czech Republic football circles. But how was he regarded in his native Scotland?
I mean, I think if you look at I think he was certainly, we spoke about some of that earlier in terms of the early days of Celtic and stuff. He was certainly highly regarded in Scotland by his contemporaries. But after he left from Prague, it's kind of difficult to assess how much of the news of his achievements and his exploits in the Czech lands would have filtered back to Scotland. The communications obviously were a bit different from where they are now, but I think there's even a tendency sometimes, just in contemporary Scottish football, when a player goes abroad, tends to maybe fall out of public view a little bit, because people are, certainly football fans tend to be quite parochial, and looking into their own teams, which I suppose I'm guilty of myself, if you want to call it that. I wouldn't say in the present day there's a huge amount of knowledge about Scottish football supporters. I think it would be Scottish football historians about in Madden's life and stuff. I think even when the blog post that led to this conversation, I entitled it "Tracing the Footsteps of an Unknown," in inverted commas, Celtic hero. So I think that maybe tells its own story. I don't think there's a huge a huge amount of knowledge. I mean, that said, the season before last season, there was some round about the time when Slavia played against Rangers in the Europa League, which was quite a controversial match, but we won't go into all that. But there was some articles appeared about Madden, telling Madden's story on the run-up to that game. Some of the paragraphs actually looked a tad familiar, having to my blog post, but that's another story. Maybe that's to do with Scottish journalists rather than anything else, but that's just one of those things, I suppose, if you put something out there on the internet. I don't think in terms of how much he's known and how much he's revered, I don't think it's even comparable to the Czech Republic. You know, there's no supporters clubs or Twitter feeds, you know, named after John Madden in Scotland, I wouldn't say, but there certainly are in here in Prague.
As to his reputation in Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, what's his lasting legacy? You mentioned a little bit.
I mean, I think it's hard to say what his legacy after all this time, you know, but I think he's clearly like an icon of Czech football, and I think he'll always be revered. You mentioned earlier, you know, that the John Madden stand, or the Tribuna Johna Maddena, as it comes in Czech, you know, and I think that'll be a permanent reminder of his legacy. I think on the blog post, I think I showed a tifo that the Slavia kind of ultra fans had done, kind of celebrating his, I think it was the anniversary of his death. So obviously it means a lot to the fans, you know. I think, I mean, there's a lot of people, you know, the Czechoslovakia, or, you know, even before that, Austria-Hungary, they've got a proud footballing history, you know. They've got a lot of very famous players and famous achievements. I mean, one's actually quite a good, another just historical fact as well, that he actually, between 1919 and 1923, Madden's rival, I suppose, or he's the manager of Sparta Prague, was a Scot as well, a guy called John Dick, who'd actually, he left a great legacy, I suppose, at Sparta as well, even though he's comparatively short time. But he had great success in the club. He'd gone on a run under his management of, they only lost one of 59 matches, and became champions of the league as it stood at the time. But probably in terms of this legacy, of Dick's legacy, was that they picked up a nickname, Železná Sparta, which translates as Iron Sparta. And even Sparta's red jerseys were actually, John Dick was an ex-Arsenal player, or Woolwich Arsenal as it would have been at that time. And he liked the Arsenal strip so much that he changed the club colours to this kind of dark red that Arsenal wore in their initial years. And they've still got that nickname, and they still wear those colours today. So that's a legacy. But I think the difference of a guy like that and a lot of other Czech football figures, but I think what's different about Madden is maybe just the length of his tenure, and this idea of it being a transformational tenure, something that really changed the game. You know, like other guys came a little bit later. So I think that's it's just the length of his, you know, his tenure, and the fact that he transformed, almost like he led a mindset shift, I suppose, in Czech football. I think that's probably, if you had to pick something, that would be his legacy. But it's hard to pinpoint one thing when the guy was there for 25 years, you know.
Does he still have a high reputation outside Slavia as well? Is he remembered generally as a pioneer?
I mean, it's hard to say. I would say so. Yeah, I'd say there would be a kind of grudging respect, you know, among I think there was representation as, you know, from the other clubs and stuff like that. I don't think that a guy can be, you know, in that length. I think there's always a kind of mutual respect, even among rivals. But certainly it's strongest among the Slavia supporters. He's almost like a holy figure, I suppose.
And in closing, are you planning further research? Do you have an ongoing project regarding the life of John William Madden?
Well, we do, as I'll explain. Like I said before, in my professional life, I work in communications and currently working on a freelance basis. But some of that work that we've done before, I worked with a Serbian colleague, Dragan, and Dragan and I have put together a number of like promotional videos for different organisations. But we kind of long talked about doing something for ourselves, just almost like a project that's maybe not driven solely by money, but something that we'd like to do. So Dragan's actually a big football fan. He's a big Partizan Belgrade fan. And we actually bonded over a game that I'd been to in Glasgow, which was very famous because Celtic managed to throw away in the last minute a 5-3 lead. They'd lost the game in Belgrade, which Dragan had attended 2-1. And so Partizan Belgrade scored at the death and put Celtic out. So we kind of bonded over that as well because it was such a famous game. I would only have been a young guy at the time. I was there with my dad.
Yeah, and, I think that's in 1989, I believe.
Yeah, I think you're right, not the early 90s, because it was, you're definitely right. 1989-90, it would have been that season because Celtic actually, the Polish striker Jakarowski scored 4 goals and still ended up exiting the tournament, because of Celtic. Celtic's defence was called the Civ by the fans, and it still is to some extent. But anyway, that's a long way to doing. But we are, like I said, we've been kind of kicking around this idea of making a documentary film about Madden's life, and we'd like to go to Dumbarton, where he was born, and shoot some stuff. So I've already reached out to a few people. I said we've spoken to some people that are connected with Celtic history. I've also reached out to Dumbarton FC. They've been very helpful. And we hope to pull this off. It'll probably be next year once we get all our ducks in a row, because as I said, it's not really anyone's day job. But we'd really like to, I hope you guys will agree, but I think it's a really intriguing, kind of fantastic story. And it would be nice to put together some kind of lasting memory of it, So I think there's a lot of hurdles that we need to go through to put this together, but we're hoping that around March, April next year that we will travel to Scotland and we'll film some of this stuff and around Dumbarton and in Glasgow, but hopefully watch this space, guys. If we do get it off the ground, I'll be sure to share it. And again, I'd like to thank you guys because you probably contacted me, gave me some stimulus to get that going again. So yeah, so we're looking into it. And there's actually quite a lot of information that we spoke about, maybe putting some kind of book together as well. But I don't know. Apparently there was some other Scottish guy in Prague that I've never met, but he emailed me and he has been preparing a book for a number of years. So in some ways, maybe we went down the film route for that. But like I said, we have some experience in putting videos together for various audiences in our professional life. So it would be quite nice to do something about this great story, I suppose.
With that, we'd like to thank you once again for your participation in this interview. For any questions and comments, you may contact us on Twitter. I'm at SP1873, and on my blog and on Facebook, I'm under Soccer Nostalgia. Mr. Paul Whittle can be contacted on Twitter at 1888 letter, and his blog is the 1888 letter. Mr. McLaughlin can be contacted on Twitter at Checo Celt, and I've also placed a link to his article on Mr. Madden that was uploaded on the Celtic Star some years back. Again, all this information is listed on the blog and podcast listings. So thank you once again, and hope to be in touch for the future.
Oh, thank you guys, and thanks for inviting me on. It's been, like I said, and thank you for giving me some stimulus to get my finger out and arrange things. But thanks, guys. It was really good speaking to you.
Thank you. It sounds like a really worthwhile project, and best of luck with that.
Okay. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.